Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all very much for coming this evening. It's finally beginning to feel a bit like winter out there, certainly in the evening times. It's brilliant to see everybody, and it's an absolute treat to be able to introduce you to Antti Lampinen. But before I talk about Antti, I'd like to, who is Assistant Director of the Finnish Institute, which is my nice segue into talking about other assistant directors. And actually, it's our current assistant director, Michael, if you would like to stand up just for 1 second. This is his last Upper House seminar before he abandons us cruelly and leaves us for a really, terrible reason. He's got a postdoc in Cambridge. Why would anyone want to leave us for a postdoc in Cambridge? So it's Michael's very last seminar, and we would like to thank him for the last 3.5 years of brilliance, for all the youth he gave us in being able to, push our social media. I mean, not just the day-to-day stuff, which all the assistant directors do, but he lent his expertise in computing and social media and everything to help, particularly during lockdown, make the events of the BSA continue in that period of closure. So we'd like to thank him, wish him the very best of luck with everything that he does after the school, post BSA. And we're very fortunate in that, in fact, he's staying around in Athens for some of the time as well. So we will get to see him hopefully at other Upper House seminars. And then the other thing, and now I'm looking, where is he? There we have our new assistant director in the audience as well. So our new assistant director is Yorgos Moratidis, and Yorgos is only here for 3 days while he does a handover with Michael. But Yorgos will be coming back to us in December, that really appropriate time to start work, 27th of December. And so he'll be coming back to start his job as assistant director. And we're very welcoming. We're very delighted to have you, Yorgos. What would they say? Coraggio, I think, really. But that is not really, not really to take away from the very wonderful experience of having Antti with us. So Antti Lampinen, as I said, is currently assistant director of the Finnish Institute, and he has a very rich range of research interests. He works on the history of ethnographical writing from the Hellenistic to late antique periods. His interests in cultural history, geography, Greek and Latin historiography, all sorts of fabulous areas. He also has published several articles on a variety of areas, including ethnic divination in Roman imperial literature, also breaching the Alps, which actually I want to read, and Mediterranean as a contested environment as well. But the other thing he did, which was Antti organized one of the most fun conferences I've ever been at. It was Seafaring and Mobility in the late antique Mediterranean in Finland. And for the most part, we drove very, very, very far away to the middle of nowhere. And there were 20 of us on a bus, and we did think we were being kidnapped in some elaborate plan to be taken out. But it was such a fantastic conference.
But how do you think Finland gets its population?
Fantastic conference. And he has now edited that volume, which came out in August. And it's a wonderful, wonderful piece of work. But tonight, Antti will be talking to us about nativism in Herodes Sophistic Attica, and we are very grateful to you, Antti. And actually, I should say he's also one of the most fabulous individuals in the world as well. So thank you, Antti, for being with us.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That is just too kind, and thank you for the wonderful invitation. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to all of you for turning up in such a great turnout. It is actually quite I would say maybe an apt theme, this change of identity, such as, changing from Michael to Yorgos, and because there is change of identity being perhaps involved, at least I very gently and carefully try to propose a change of identification for the sculpture you see here on the starting slide in the middle. But in order to get to there, we sort of need to take a circuitous route which does take in quite a sort of wide range of things, which I hope is a bonus, something for everybody. And on the other hand, I will be hopefully able to benefit from this wonderful collected expertise and deep source of knowledge that the audience represents here, in the sense that if I do say something silly, or if it does just seem a bit implausible, do say, because I haven't published it yet, so everything can be remedied at this point. So anyway, yes, let's see, not there. Should I? Okay, there we go. So this is roughly the structure of today's talk. I would first like to start with rather general, well-known points about Greek originalist thinking or Greek nativistic thinking during the Second Sophistic. There's not much new ground I can offer there really, but as a background for what follows. From that, I would like to proceed to discuss at more depth Polemo of Laodicea and his Physiognomica text, a really rich and interesting text, as well as possibly related implications regarding educational mobility. This is a topic which I've been thinking about quite a lot, for instance, in this article which Rebecca mentioned about preaching the Alps, but also there is a forthcoming piece which is also about criticism against mobility or moral panics to do with mobility in imperial era, largely 2nd century. So in that sense, this section 3 is very much related to that topic. Then I will slightly change tack and discuss this bust, which can be seen in Acropolis Museum and which is often identified as Bosporan king, usually Sauromates II. And I do possibly want to maybe examine whether this identification is the only possible one, or whether we could maybe find an Athens-centric, or at least Attica-centric explanation or identification for this statue. And then some concluding remarks. So, but if we start from this Greek originalist or nativistic thinking in the Second Sophistic, I feel like if we do jump to the sort of mid or late scene of the Second Sophistic, to Aelius Aristides, to be exact, to Panathenaikos, we do see this kind of thinking in quite a sort of well-rehearsed, quite sort of established form. In section 13, Aristides mentions, describes Attica as katharos, representing the Hellenes, remaining to the barbarians, alophilos. Athens has been also appointed to oppose the barbarians as its natural enemy, displays in her works her innocent, pure and uncorrupted spirit. This term of uncorrupted is quite interesting because it crops up later, and is also a linguistic model for the Hellenic world, introducing an unadulterated, pure and flawless idiom. Of course, this sort of Atticistic points which are really, really common by this time, but we are basically going backwards from Aristides into an earlier stage. Also, Attica, of course, produced the first humans, protogar enken anthropon kai prote patris estin anthropu, the first home for humankind, and the genos of Athenians, with a water metaphor here, is springing from the bosom of the earth. And only in this land do aliens and citizens appear clearly distinguished. This sort of points. This strain of arguments, this kind of rhetoric takes, of course, its cue from the Periclean rhetoric of autochthony. But the fact of Aristides so strongly emphasizing is it, I would say, has some very clearly 2nd century epistemic needs and motivations, of course. Nonetheless, I think it is a worthy starting point because it represents so well the condensation of many of the themes which other figures of the Second Sophistic before him, before Aristides, had already been making quite sort of distinctive use of. One of the first one of them was, of course, Dio Chrysostom, who really seems to have been quite interested in the idea of changing or remaining or retaining of ethnically framed qualities. He actually prefigures many themes which Polemo, who we are going to turn to next, took further. Polemo, of course, being Dio Chrysostom's pupil. Dio wrote a lost monograph called Attica. Themes of Hellenicity and barbarity are also really prominent in his 36th oration, the Boris Tenetikos. Thomas Schmidt has argued that barbarian peoples in their own lands were sort of free material, suitable material for Dio, which he approached largely through this very conventional dichotomy between barbarians and Hellenes, with perhaps Rome complicating this dichotomy, as happened for many other sophists of the same era as well. Simon Swain has also pointed out that Dio was a prominent voice of criticism of the Roman rule, expressing even regret on the dependency of Greek regional elites on Rome. He also occasionally implies, Dio does, that Hellenicity can degenerate due to association with non-Greeks, already quite close to this sort of originalist nativistic thinking. And in some other loci, he offers many unfavorable comparisons where causation is not exactly stated out very clearly. In Oration 33, he, in fact, considering that we turn to physiognomy next, he reads the bodily signs of the inhabitants of Tarsos, their weird kind of, well, it's a difficult verb to translate because it can be snorting, it can be heavy breathing, it can be snoring, something which the Tarsians do while speaking or breathing seems to indicate to Dio that they are more debauched even than Phoenicians. In Oration 31, he compares that Rhodians are no longer any better than Egyptians, Libyans, and Phrygians. In the same oration, he also is quite pessimistic about Greeks on the whole. And then, of course, in Oration 32, famously, he really lets it rip regarding the Alexandrians and their qualities or lack of qualities. Simon Swain has pointed out, and I completely agree with him, that in Dio and Polemo, we probably see this idea of pure Greeks being passed on from the teacher to the pupil, who, for his own personal reasons and for his own rhetorical reasons, clearly seems to have seized this theme of pure Hellenicity very eagerly. Marcus Antonius Polemo of Laodicea, originally very famously involved with the city of Smyrna in much of his career, was undoubtedly one of the luminaries of the Sophistic movement. He was Hadrian's friend, prolific teacher, including teacher of Herodes Atticus when Herodes was already quite sort of man of mature years. He was also famous for his epic animosity with the Gallic sophist Favorinus. And overall, it seems, at least from the basis of Philostratus, that Polemo was a truly arrogant, actually quite a sort of horrid seeming person. He was also a firm believer in physiognomy, on being able to distinguish genuine Greekness from physical signs through physiognomical reading. And he certainly put this into very discriminative use, as he also put many other aspects or many other theories of his physiognomical handbook. Ilaria Romeo has even argued that Polemo, due to his close connections with Hadrian and this quite a visceral and originalist emphasis on the purity of the Greeks, he may have even been able to influence some of the principles or ideologies behind Hadrian's Panhellenion, but that perhaps remains debatable. In any case, Polemo's actual Physiognomonica is lost in its original form, but as in the wonderful edition of Simon Swain and others, Seeing the Face, Seeing the Soul, which we have now been able to benefit for the past 15 years, and which I feel like has really revivified the study of not only Polemo, but ancient physiognomical theories on the whole, we are able to reconstruct Polemo's Physiognomica through three principal sources. The so-called anonymous Latin De Physiognomonia from the late 300s, Adamantius, the Iatrosophists, Jewish Alexandrian Iatrosophist, or a sort of, I suppose, doctor, but also a sort of polymath, His Greek language physiognomica, which combines, I mean, there is lots of Polemo in there clearly, as we can see from comparisons between that and the last item here, but there are also, at least technically, theoretically, other earlier physiognomist writers being distilled through Polemo partly or maybe independently. The third one is, of course, the Arabic tradition, which I cannot access in its original language, but I completely trust Robert Hoyland's excellent translation and edition of this in this very same volume. It seems to be based on these comparisons between that and Adamant, especially the so-called Leiden Polemo Leidensis. It seems to be remarkably faithful to large sections of Polemo's original. Wonderful example of using the Arabic tradition to save and excavate otherwise very poorly preserved texts. So if we do start with this idea that Dio's idea of Hellenic purity was fundamental to Polemo's own physiognomical project, we can perhaps cite from Adamantius. Okay, sorry, I'm doing something a bit silly here with the thing. I just tried to move it away. Let's put it minimized. Yes, anyway. Yes, so in Adamantius, the following definition of the so-called pure Greek is found. Any who have guarded the Hellenic and Ionic race and kept it pure are sufficiently large men, rather broad, upright, strong, with a rather white color, pale, having moderate and rather firm mixture of flesh. We see lots of this sort of middle road, sort of the messe in everything. Straight legs, shapely extremities, round head of medium size, strong neck, rather pale and soft hair that curls gently, a square face, thin lips, straight nose and moist, dark blue, fierce eyes with plenty of light in them, for the Hellenic race has the best eyes of all races. This is, of course, pretty blunt stuff, and clearly we see that in Polemonian physiognomy, at least, the eyes are really the mirror of the soul already at this stage. And obviously this Hellenic race has the best eyes of all races is very much a moral point about the Hellenic soul. But what Polemo does in this kind of antimemic physiognomical readings is that he essentially works with this sort of completely hypothetical, theoretical, unitary, notional perfection. And then any diagnostic potential that physiognomy has is essentially yielded from any like deviation from this unitary perfection, which is in a way defined through these three classical physiognomical analogies. Animal analogies, in which lion-like is best, gendered analogies where the male is best, obviously always better than the female, and ethnic ones, where the Hellenic is the best, and any kind of non-Hellenicity can be diagnosed according to ethnic stereotypes, etc. Comparisons with emotional states do occur, as in the earlier Aristotelian physiognomy as well, such as, you know, the person who showcases, for instance, a facial expression that is typically associated with, say, anger, must have angry disposition, etc. But these are sort of like very situationally, you know, wielded. If we combine this with Philostratian evidence, we might see some indications that Polemo may have physiognomized his prospective students even. This is interesting because Philostratus generally avoids mentioning Polemo's physiognomical obsession, as Callan has very well argued, possibly out of respect for Favorinus, because Favorinus somehow gender-bendingly remarkable sophistic individual who also happened to be Polemo's great enemy, is the subject of one of the most hostile physiognomical readings in the whole of Physiognomonica. Favorinus is used as this sort of ultimate case study of whatever can be wrong in a person. And this would have been a problem for Philostratus, because Philostratus had a sophistic lineage, a pedigree that went to both Favorinus and Polemo. via Herodes Atticus. But what Philostratus writes is, by opening his school at Smyrna, Polemo benefited the city in the following ways. In the first place, he made her appear far more populous than before, since the youth flowed into her from both continents and the islands, nor were they dissolute and promiscuous rabble, but select and genuinely Hellenic. Al exelegmenes de kakatharos and lados. So this isn't, of course, a clear sign of necessarily physiognomizing them, but there seems to have been some sort of emphasis on the Hellenic pedigree of Polemo's pupils. Polemo's own voice may come across from Polemo Laodensis in Hoyland's translation. This seems to have something similar, clearly deriving from similar Polemonian emphasis. I will mention the form. This is essentially from the same section as this one, the Adamantios' section on the pure Greek. I will mention the forms of the Greeks whose forms are pure and nothing from the other races is mixed with them. They are a people who share in their land, meaning now are sharing in their land. Others have become numerous among them because people want them and their land, either for the pleasantness of their life and their moderate temperament and passion, or out of desire for their knowledge, their good way of life and their laws. They are the people of Argos, Corinth, and other lands of theirs. This is the description of the pure Greek. There in the ellipsis, there is essentially the section which is very similar to this Adamantios' section, which we saw in the previous slide. So what do we see then in here? I mean, for a cultural scene where educational mobility was comparatively common, obviously mobility was not, as Greg Wolf and others have pointed out, it affected a very, very small, although quite intensely mobile section of the society. But educational mobility was common among the sophists, for sure. So it is quite interesting to see this sort of nervousness. It's almost counterintuitive, this nervousness about its effects. But I do feel like probably the actual realities of traveling for education could have still clashed with this emphasis on purity, essentialism, at least in the case of Gaius and Polemo's lineage, and this genealogically defined Hellenicity. And there could, of course, have been, considering that we are dealing with a very classicizing cultural scene, there could have been also this sort of residual notions of travel, introducing corruption, lessening purity, especially when it was mercantile mobility, seafaring, stuff like that, as came very clearly across from some of the contributions to this edited volume I've been editing recently. And of course, as Benjamin Isaac and Maria Pretzler and others have been pointing out very well, provincial rivals in the great cultural centers were clearly under scrutiny, Adam Kemesis as well. The stakes would have been particularly high in Athens, of course, especially for Philostratus, who is so Herodes-centered and Athenocentric. Indeed, Adam Kemesis has mentioned that Philostratus sees Athens as particularly suited to mimesis of the classical past. Herodes and his fellow Athens-based or Athens-trained sophists can engage with and imitate their ancestors in ways not possible elsewhere. I think that's a very good point. And Herodes Atticus himself, the king of letters, Basileus non logon, as Estelle Strastins has been pointing out, also goes as a new Theseus. So we have this particular role-playing going on. And with the Theseus, we really move to the context of Marathon in a way, and what follows soon, the interesting, complex, kind of often discussed anecdote or episode in Philostratus in the life of Herodes Atticus there, where Philostratus cites Herodes' letter to Julian, a certain Julianus, could have been a consul, Tiberius Claudius Julianus, about his meeting with this rural hero who was known as Heracles of Herodes or Agathion. This is just a small section from the middle of it. We see the first part of this anecdote a bit later, but this is the one to do with language and mobility and educational mobility. So let's cite this one in here. They have met now, etc. And what about your speech? Asked Herodes. How were you educated and by whom? For you do not seem to be an uneducated man. Agathion replies, the interior of Attica educated me, a good school for a man who wishes to be able to converse. For the Athenians in the city admit as hirelings youths who come in like a flood from Thrace and the Pontus and from other barbarian peoples, and their own speech deteriorates from the influence of these barbarians to a greater extent than they can contribute to the improvement of the speech of the newcomers. but the central district is untainted by barbarians, and hence its language remains uncorrupted, and its dialect sounds the purest strain of Attis. This is that old, already a century-old translation, but I used it for the sake of convenience. But it's of course interesting what this misthude komenoi thrakia kai pontika meirakia actually refer. But it is interesting also that, although I suppose it could be technically a reference to slave mobility, but this educational context of this conversation and the explicit age reference, I think, make it much likelier that students are meant. But as you can see from the other vocabulary here, like especially xyneruekota, it's a remarkably outcasting tone here. And similarly, at the end of this section, the lack of mixture amictos in the Attic Mesogeia is actually expressed through a very explicit health analogy. Hygiene, it's thriving in its health because of this, because of being amictos. So emphasis is on authenticity, of course, validation of Herodes Atticus' own speech, but I would say something else as well. And with that, we could move to this piece. Let me just have a sip. Yes, so I'm sure you have all seen this. It's very tricky to not to see it, even if you have already gone through the whole of Acropolis Museum and are slightly dazed and just staggering back. But you know, it is in the late antique and Roman imperial section, one of the very capolabori, absolutely. So it's catalogue number 419. Its provenience is very hazy. It's been found in the 1870s from the Theatre of Dionysus or nearby somewhere on the southern slope. All these problems with the provenience that are typical to that area, I think, pretty much apply. And now, of course, I am not an art historian, and there are many people here who will be able to put me to my place in this regard. But let me have a go. I think that the traditional dating to Antonine/Severan era seems pretty likely. I think in terms of iconography, it seems quite well justified. Marcus Aurelius and Commodus are the most commonly cited emperors under whom this could have been commissioned. Calzas dates it even to Severan era, not a problem for me. Stavridi even suggested Gallienus's era, 260s, which seems a bit late, maybe, but possible, I suppose. But definitely not a majority opinion, this one. As for the piece itself, fairly undamaged. The hair has been largely restored from the back especially, but its length is quite clear. It has been flowing until the shoulders. And as we see from the next slide, at the back there are some remains of a acanthus leaves or a calyx of a flower. So the bust has been in a way growing from a flowery thing, or a vegetation at least. And as the Acropolis Museum website also shows, the most common identification is generally a Bosporan king, usually Sauromates II or his grandfather Oimetalkes. There you can see the calyx or a acanthus sprout there. In terms of iconography, and this is, I suppose, why I first became interested in this piece, because I have been dealing with the ethnographies of the northern peoples in the long Hellenistic era quite extensively. So it did remind me of this typical, and of course you can still have a frontal look at the hair as well, that's the back look. It does remind one very easily of this utterly stereotypical hair of the northerners, the way it's, for instance, described in Diodorus Siculus. For the Celts are always washing their hair in lime water, and they pull it back from the forehead to the top of the head and back to the nape of the neck, with the result that their appearance is that of satyrs and pans, since the treatment of their hair makes it so heavy and coarse that it differs in no respect from the mane of horses. Well, maybe not quite that though, maybe not quite. This seems a bit more pliable hair after all, not quite the sort of thing we see in, for instance, that I didn't get a good quality photo of that, but in the Museum of Cairo, there is a beautiful Hellenistic head of a Gaul, which has got very sort of like almost standing on its end kind of hair, very sort of thick, stiff looking curls. Not even curls, really. As Fitchen and others have pointed out, of course, this kind of, apart from the length, there are also some similarities with this sort of more barbarian Köfe styles of Alexander iconography, but this is not necessarily important with this piece. Of course, I mean, my early impulse would have been to take this exactly at its face value, maybe read it alongside Dioscorus Veneticus, which is about Hellenicity and barbarity, Hellenicity and Scythianness intermingling in the northern Pontic region, and maybe to just tell students, for instance, that this is clearly a piece of a study on Hellenicity, barbarity, perhaps rulership, especially if we take this Bosporan king as an identification. But I do think there is another way to read it, and we get to that. But first, we do need to speak about the identification as Bosporan kings. To me, it seems really to just rely on the numismatic similarities of these particular two rulers. I'm not sure if that's quite enough. Ideally, of course, this kind of numismatic identification would be strengthened by something to tie these rulers with Athens, but we do not have anything for Bosporan kings of the 2nd century connecting them with Athens, unlike, of course, the Spartakids in the classical era, who had extensive connections with Athens and are quite a different thing. Now, Rhoemetalkes, who here is shown on the obverse of a coin with Hadrian on the reverse, I think once addresses in an inscription Hadrian as Ctistes and I think benefactor and founder, yes. But I don't. That still doesn't mean any connection with Hadrian. You know, Hadrian's close connections to Athens don't necessarily convert into Rhoemetalkes' connections to Athens. And also, it is a bit early, perhaps, for the iconography of this piece, especially that sort of deep drilling of the hair and the eyes, which look so extremely sort of Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, that kind of thing. Now, and besides this, Rhoemetalkes' identification has been done away with quite several decades ago, largely. The more conventional identity is Sauromates II, who ruled for a very long time, indeed, the whole last quarter of the 2nd century, and until even Septimius Severus and Caratallas rule. And as you can see, he also shows up in his coins with that sort of like a longish beard, mid-long beard, kind of fairly combed, back-swept hair, and of course a tinea there tying the hair back. But is this really that close to the piece? I'm not quite sure, and I do feel like this prioritizes the numismatic evidence quite a lot. But let's, at least for the sake of the argument, look more at this anecdote of Agathion. It's a long bit, but I will read it out loud because it's quite relevant, all of it, and this is the start of it. So this is Herodes Atticus in a letter to Julianus, but obviously potentially paraphrased, potentially adapted, potentially manipulated by Philostratus himself. After the being whom most men used to call the Heracles of Herodes, this was a youth in early manhood as tall as a tall Celt, and in fact about 8 feet high. Herodes describes him in one of his letters to Julian. He says that his hair grew evenly on his head, his eyebrows were bushy and they met as though they were but one, and his eyes gave out a brilliant gleam which betrayed his impulsive temperament. He was hook-nosed and had a solidly built neck, which was due rather to work than to diet. His chest, too, was well-formed and beautifully slim, and his legs were slightly bowed outwards, which made it easy for him to stand firmly planted. He was draped in wolfskins, sewed together to make a garment, and he used to contend against wild boars, jackals, wolves, and mad bulls, and would exhibit the scars from these combats. Some say that this Heracles was earthborn, Gegenes, and sprang from the folk of Boeotia. But Herodes says that he heard him say that his mother was a woman so strong that she herded cattle, and his father was that Marathon whose statue is at Marathon, and he is a rustic hero. Herodes asked this Heracles whether he was also immortal, to which he replied, "I'm only longer lived than a mortal." Then he asked him what he lived on, and he said, "I live chiefly on milk, and I'm fed by goats and herds of cows and brood mares, and the she-ass also provides a sweet sort of milk and light to digest. But when I meet with barley meal, I eat 10 quarts, And the farmers of Marathon and Boeotia supply me with this feast. They also nickname me Agathion because they think that I bring them luck. It's an amazing piece. It's really, really interesting. It has been discussed a bit, but perhaps not quite as much as it would deserve. It's really quite something. It's a paradoxographic sounding anecdote, of course, as Ewan Bowie has been saying. It brings these autochthonous and rustic themes into a context that is really, really about culture and education. And of course, what links between these two is the originalist theme of Attic diction, which we saw in that earlier passage from the middle of that section, where indeed Agathion says that the Attic Mesogeia is thriving in health because there are no foreigners coming there, and he's gotten his pure diction from there. It's a pity that background image is a bit skewed. It should be, of course, the statue of Memnon in a bit more ordinary shape. It's slightly, well, anyway. Now, of course, yes, I already referred to the fact that this is essentially Philostratus reputedly quoting a letter from Herodes Atticus. So we do have a bit of a problem in terms of attributing a date for this. It can be a paraphrase, probably is. Jan Kinstraat has been saying that since the 80s. Simon Swain and Dominique Cotet have recently sort of discussed the same problem, the problem of attribution. But what seems quite clear is that this figure of Agathion, as Philostratus uses or deploys him, whether Herodian or not, is very probably connected with this otherwise very heroic figure of Sostratos or Sosastros, which we know from Plutarch and Lucian's Demonarchs. I mean, it is probably a literary artifact, this whole figure, although Kinstrand wanted to see it as based on an actual living individual who would have had quite an amazingly long lifetime, frankly. But what I think this passage does, first and foremost, is it conjures up an idealized alter ego for Herodes himself, a marathon-born hero. And punningly, of course, Herodes may mean also singing for Hera, but Herodes sounds like hero-looking. And this could be a pun there. I mean, literally hero-looking Herodes there. And the pure language of this Agathion is, of course, in perfect harmony with Herodes' own autochthonous origins. How much more Atticus can you get, in a way? And he emulates the ancient heroes as well. As we know, Herodes Atticus was really emphatic on his Chimonid descent from Miltiades and Cimon. So this also kind of focuses on that plane of Marathon. And we know that Herodes' villas all over Greece really showcased busts of many of his extended family members and trophimoi. The most famous one, of course, was Polydeukion, his own little Antinos, in a way, the same kind of hero worship. But what all these do, and the bust of Memnon, which is actually pretty indistinguishable in the background now here, does show that attention was paid in these to physiognomies, whether individual ones or ethnicized ones. Memnon was this Ethiopian sub-Saharan African sophist who was a trophimos of Herodes Atticus, and hence the only sub-Saharan African sophist that we know by name. We have his head preserved in nowadays in Berlin, but in Marathon Museum you have at least a preserved base of a herma of his. So, in short, my suggestion is, what if we would see the Sauromates bust as depicting Agathion instead? Let's delve a little bit further. So, of course, this sort of stories, if we have really this kind of stories resembling, of this figure resembling the Sostratos/Sosastros that Plutarch and Lucian mention, and then Agathion, who ends up in Herodes Atticus or Philostratus, the stories were probably pretty well known, and they would have become pretty well known, even better known, after the Vitae Sophistarum started circulating in the Severan era. So, should we date this bust then during Herodes' lifetime or after? Well, if it was during Herodes' lifetime, the bust would have probably participated in this widespread erecting of busts and statues of Herodes' family members, entourage, students, and trophimoi. It does have resemblances with Antonine portraiture, so that could do perhaps. On the other hand, if it's been set up after, it could actually depend on its significance and in its recognizability on Philostratus's Vitae Sophistarum, as well as of course the continuing importance of Herodes Atticus's reputation and influence through his pupils through his euergetistic donations in the city of Athens and the Athenian scene. Of course, Philostratus dedicated Vitae Sophistarum to a descendant of Herodes Atticus, Gordianus, so that could be motivation enough. As for the locality, well, really impossible to say. It's just maybe, well, Herodes did sprinkle busts of himself and his family all around Greece, and maybe the area around the theater of Dionysus is not such a bad locality for this either. Especially if it is indeed Agathion as a demigod from Marathon, possibly sprouting from vegetation, which does not need to be a funereal context, of course not. I mean, there are plenty of other ways in which we can think about an acanthus as well. And as Dominique Cotet and others have been pointing out, Agathion is really described in the passage we saw according to a Polemonian kind of physiognomy. Herodes' own sophistic pedigree, the fact that he had studied with Polemo, who was a student of Dio of Prusa, probably made him too very well aware of physiognomical inferences. And this was, of course, something which was common to the whole sophistic. Oh, it's okay, it's skewed there as well. Well, you saw the actual bust in a better aspect ratio earlier. But so I just thought we could do a little bit of a comparison. Agathion as he is described in Philostratus, and how would this tally with Polemonian physiognomy? So his eyebrows were bushy and met as though they were but one. When you met, yeah, you can see from the bust that is indeed the case. Polemo does not discuss eyebrows in isolation. In Polemonian physiognomy, the eyebrows always seem to be read in connection with either the eyes or the forehead or both. But there are some indications that they can emphasize the message or the reading that the eyes or the forehead produce. Secondly, his eyes gave out a brilliant gleam, which betrayed his impulsive temperament. Well, the reading is already there, really. I mean, the signal is already read out. Now, gleaming eyes can indicate many, many things in Polemo's very extensive eye physiognomy. The whole second book was essentially on that one. And Polemo also did very strange things with this idea of gleaming eyes, because it seems that the size of the eye is then all, what matters. Small but gleaming eyes, very bad. Large but gleaming eyes, sort of okay if the pupil and other sort of coloration things agree. For instance, there is reading of Hadrian's eyes, which has been generally, in the past, it was often read as a completely laudatory reading of Hadrian's eyes, in which Polemo would have needed to actually jump through quite a lot of loops in order to make Hadrian's eyes somehow complementary. It's nowadays thought by Simon Swain and others that actually it could post-date Hadrian's death, and maybe Polemo did have actually much more freedom in reading out Hadrian's debauchery and love of Antinos and stuff like that out of these eyes in a posthumous assessment. But it's a tricky thing. Gleaming eyes on their own don't really signal anything one way or the other. He was hook-nosed and had solidly built neck, which was due rather to work than to diet. Also, he was as tall as a tall Celt. Well, in Adamantius's Physiognomy 2.21, a moderately long and thick neck, which is firm and strong, refers to those who are brave, good at learning, and naturally disposed to virtue. A bit later, great-mindedness is shown by hooked noses. Well, this would fit with Philostratus's or Herodes's description. Lastly, his chest too was well formed and beautifully slim, and his legs were slightly bowed outwards, which made it easy for him to stand firmly planted. Well, these broadly fit quite well with this perfect masculine physiognomy as Adamantius outlines in book 2. And also, I mean, there is a bit of a connection here with the way in which during the Second Sophistic athletic physiognomies were observed and sort of like ranked as to what was good for what, etc. And what we saw earlier in Adamantius is 2.32, the physiognomy of the pure Greek, which now is under threat from foreigners moving in, and the corresponding passages in this Arabic Polemo of Laodicea. They do include the details of straight legs. Well, of course, in the case of Agathion, they are, I think, slightly bent legs, so maybe this isn't a perfect fit, but strong neck and gently curling hair, as well as luminous eyes, are indicators of this perfect Greek. So what Adamantius says, in terms of hair, the middle way between curls and straight is the best. A man with curly hair is very cowardly and wily, and a man with straight hair is rather wild and mindless. The best hair is between these. The mean of these is praiseworthy. Yeah, so this sort of typical thing. Now, of course, I would say that there is perfectly good reasons to see this kind of emphasis on physiognomical science, even in Philostratus. Even though Philostratus would have had his own reasons to keep it slightly out from Vitae Philosophorum, as Calon has argued. But Adam Kemesis has, on the other hand, said that, after he studied with Polemo in the late 30s, 130s, Herodes would have used Polemo as a model for his students, recommending that they would read his works. And then we do have, in a way, this Polemonian physiognomical theory basis entering into the tradition, which became quite shaped by Herodes' students. And in any case, they were truly ubiquitous in the context of the Second Sophistic. So then, to conclude, well, there we have a better rendition of the unibrow and all sorts of things. So I maybe, rather than Sauromates II, maybe it could portray Agathion. I mean, that's at least what I'm going to put forth now. It would emphasize the nature, the mixture of this sort of uncomplicated naturalness and the Attic originalism of this latter-day Heracles, the high quality of the bust, the references to imperial iconography, and its interest in clearly distinctive physiognomy would, I would say, be quite good links with the rest of the Herodian cycle of busts, perhaps. The acanthus leaves, I feel, could work also for a rural heroes depiction. It doesn't need to be necessarily a deceased person an already dead person, as the Acropolis Museum website says. Also, frankly, Sauromates II was still alive until 210 at least, so it wouldn't be a dead person unless we really look for a late Severan era. So, and then in this Herodian / Philostratian anecdote about Agathion, the focus is, as we saw, on autochthony, the historical exemplarity of Marathon, the explicitly mentioned healthy purity of Attic Mesogeia, and the threat, interestingly, of seaborne mobility. Agathion's linguistic purity reinforces, of course, the credentials of Herodes himself. The locality is important for him as a landowner, important for him as a reputed Chimonid descendant. And obviously Marathon is the place where Hellas has been defended from seaborne invading barbarians. So the exemplum of the Persian Wars is quite salient in here, I feel. So I would not want to be pushed as to the dating. I mean, I feel either Herodes' own lifetime or the Philostratian horizon could work for the bust pretty much equally. As we see, the Vitae Sophistarum is dedicated to Herodes' descendant, Gordianus, and Vitae Sophistarum engages with this very strongly enduring memory of Herodes at Athens, as well as, of course, reflecting some of the concerns of the circle more broadly. I feel like after that little test reading between the physiognomies of Philostratus' description and the Polemonian physiognomy, the bust is pretty good fit, both regarding Philostratus' description, especially the eyebrows, I can't get over them, and the Polemonian theory. Both this statue of the bust and the Agathion anecdote seem to echo the Polemonian ideal of a masculine Hellenic leonine physiognomy. And in fact, in a section which I didn't show today in the anecdote, but simply because it's not very interesting, but Agathion, after criticizing theater, because it shows all sorts of immoral things, and how actually Greek athletic games are not that great, because surely the swift people should compete with horses and strong people should compete with bears instead of people competing amongst each other. So that's a bit of a criticism there. But then Agathion complains that it's just such a pity that there are no lions in Greece anymore, because that would be a good opponent. So in a way, even though there are no lions in Greece anymore, as Agathion complains, but in a way, a Hellenic lion has been conjured up in the Marathonian plain in this anecdote. So, I mean, whether it's Heracles of Herodes or Herodes as Heracles in the anecdote, I think it's pretty obvious that Agathion in the anecdote is Herodes' alter ego. And if this is Agathion, this bust, then I suppose in a way it is yet another portrait bust of Herodes himself, but Herodes as a sort of wild epaidomenos in this case.
Thank you very much, Antti, for that really interesting paper. And there are so many people here that I suspect have got lots of questions for you. And I think maybe we just open up the floor to questions. And Michael, if you keep an eye on online questions as well, would anyone like to start off? Oh, okay, let's have Olga there. She just pipped you to the post.
Well, I would like to thank you very much for your paper, but I am going to make some remarks as a sculpture specialist.
Yes, I would be very thankful.
Okay, this head cannot belong to a statue because it has the acanthus leaves. Therefore, it has to be a bust. Yes. Because it is confined by the acanthus leaves, it doesn't continue. So it's not a statue.
No.
Okay.
That's true. I may have called it statue accidentally. That's true. Yeah. Bust.
But it's a bust.
Yes.
Second, if it has acanthus leaves, it's almost certainly a human who is dead. If you really want to argue that this is a hero connected to vegetation, you have to produce examples of divinities with acanthus leaves.
That is exactly.
So you have to look into this.
Yes.
I think this is a portrait of a deceased person. We have a very extensive bibliography and many examples of busts of dead people with acanthus leaves. And in Athens, we have a bust of Alexander the Great, which is in the Agora. It's an unfinished bust, and it has acanthus leaves because when they made this bust, he was, of course, long dead.
I see.
I have actually written about this bust. I can give you the.
I would be extremely thankful. I would be extremely thankful. Yes.
So, in my opinion, this cannot be a hero. It has to be a human.
Right.
And it has to be a portrait. And the other thing is, if you want to connect it with Herodes Atticus, you have to produce something connected with Herodes Atticus that comes from the theater of Dionysus or the South Slope. And so far, nothing has been found. Everything connected with Herodes comes from Kiphysia or from Marathon.
But that I think is pretty conclusive in many ways. I mean, that those are very good points.
So you really have to find lots of examples to prove your point, that I cannot think of any.
Well, that is very good. I mean, this was an exercise, definitely in connecting slightly disparate things, but those are all extremely useful to me, because then I do know now what incredibly important points in terms of Athenian material there are against this attribution. So according to you, then it could not be Sauromates II either, really?
No, of course not.
Yes.
I don't think we know who it is, but it is somebody who imitated Alexander. I believe that fiction pointed this out. He was the first one. And I think he was right. This is someone who imitated Alexander. I have no idea. I don't think we can tell who it is.
Right.
But if he is, if we have his bust in the theater or the South Slope, it must be somebody who had connections with Athens.
True. Very good. Thank you. That definitely saves me a lot of effort in writing this into any kind of article, because that obviously provides huge hurdles, which I don't think I'm qualified to even try to jump through. My focus very much has been previously in the ethnic elements and the physiognomy, for sure. So I think I will stick to, as in also one article which is in preparation, I fortunately quite stuck to this connection between the Agathion anecdote and Herodes Atticus, which fortunately did not mention the sculpture at all. So you have spared me an incredible embarrassment in here.
But
so
not,
that's very good.
not necessarily. I
Not
mean,
necessarily, but
are there examples of Agathion portraits anywhere? No.
no.
And I mean, the South Slope isn't that far away from the Odeon, is it? I mean, I should say the Odeon is on it. It's very close.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is there anything missing from the Odeon in that way?
No.
Nope.
I was clutching.
Yeah, no, I think that's all very good. I was actually secretly hoping that Professor Palaya would be here, because I mean, definitely this is exactly the sort of info which is pretty crucial for this slightly hazy suggestion.
It's
Thank you so much.
still interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was amusing to do the reading, especially between the anecdote itself and Herodes' own ideology, which are quite interesting.
Are there other questions? Go ahead.
Well, I would like to mention something that refers to physiognomy studies
Mm-hmm.
in the late 19th and perhaps also the 20th century, early 20th century, I'm not sure. In the early 20th century, there was an Italian writer, was a criminologist.
Oh yes.
Who claimed that he could, detect if one person is guilty or not by looking at his appearance. And there's another example, which is similar but more liberal, which is in Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, where the policeman has a hunch that Raskolnikov is guilty, but he can't do anything because he has no proof. Until Raskolnikov gives himself in at the behest of his fiancée, who wants him to come clear. But there's the thing that, you can't actually prove it, but you may be right, you may be wrong. So
it's terrifyingly situational, the whole rhetorical deployment of physiognomy, and we see it all through the Polemonian material, how incredibly vague he makes. It is a flexible, but I would say in wrong hands, and I would argue that Polemo's hands could have frequently been the wrong hands. Deployed in those, it would have been a terrifying weapon for character assassination. And Polemo is all about the surface in a way. He was, at least in his Philostratian persona, he lives his whole life for display. He takes great pride in his looks. When he starts to feel old age creeping in, he essentially commits suicide, has himself buried alive.
No way.
Yeah, he lives the whole life for the look, for reading the surface. Then when his own age starts to creep in, he in a way takes himself out from the, and he even sees that, let it never be, let the sun never see me reduced to silence. Psychologically, that's quite interesting. He takes himself out into the tomb from the all-seeing sun, and he refuses to be read in a way. But it's a very interesting, Polemo psychology has been, which one is it in here? Has been treated by, Jérôme Lauver's 2015, Narcissism and Sophistry. It's rather an interesting piece where narcissistic personality syndrome is very much sort of read against Polemo's.
Yes, he can't stand the idea of himself living up to his own ideal.
Right, yes.
It's interesting.
Are there other questions? Petra.
Yes, thank you, Antti. It was lovely to hear you again. Very nice. Of course, there is a debate. I just want to pick up one detail, and you might not be surprised what that is.
Or the letter.
Yes, I
Yes.
guess maybe. Anyway, I also think that there is there's such a rich material that you have, such fascinating material that you deal with. All these references to physiognomy, it's such a rich field, and as you mentioned, certainly deserves to be more studied. Now, these little attributions in the sense of how people look and how they are. There's also this field that you have there, attributions for their garments. There was this wolf skin.
Oh yes, there was indeed. Yeah, that's true.
The skin is quite often they here is an example. I think that there would be room to expand rather than going to identification.
That's true. That's true.
Maybe to go there with the associations with animals around the skins when they come, because skin, some people are wearing certain types of skin garments. There seems to be quite clear pointing to something that could be explored. In this case, it was the wolf skins. But I would like to, do you remember what was the word for wolf skins?
Oh, here I don't have it, but we can easily check it any working there at the Institute. Yeah, this is true, of course, because here the wolf skin, after this section here, which is incredibly physiognomizing, the wolf skin in a way does act as an animal analogy as well. And as we know, in ancient physiognomy, there were three principal kinds of analogies: the gendered ones, the animal analogies, and the ethnicized analogies. And here, the Celt is obviously an ethnicized analogy in terms of the height. And here the wolf skins, I think they could well work in this sort of animal analogy role, for sure.
But there's quite often, if we have people in a or heroes, or somebody who is a significant person, or if they are clad in wolf skins particularly, so there is usually an association of being really sneaky, somehow negative. Because as we know that in Rome, those who come in lion skin, those who come in leopard skin are maybe not as great as the lion stuff that was. And then someone who is in wolf skin is a little bit tricky person, a bit sneaky, somehow a bit dangerous as well. Yeah,
that's an interesting one, because of course here there is already the mention of impulsive temperament here a few lines earlier. If this is an animal analogy, that definitely is not an automatically complementary one. You are quite right about that. On the other hand, if we do connect this with this figure of Sostratos or Sosastros in Plutarch and Lucian, from those two sources we know that this kind of wild philosopher, wild man, Gegenes, earthborn, almost cynic-like figure, new Heracles, the Sosastros was credited for helping farmers by killing animals such as wolves and bears. So this could technically be a sort of little sort of literary remnant of that other tradition, from which probably Herodes picked this whole figure up, I would say.
Okay, nice. I think it's an online question. Michael?
A question from online. Might this bust have come from a secondary context in a late Roman philosophical school on the south slope? Would it be worth seeking a similar acanthus leaf in Athenian architectural decoration of the later 2nd, early 3rd century? The form is unusual, but not unknown.
Here I can only defer to the experts, but I mean, we do have, of course, architecture that is not funerary, with acanthus.
Of course,
But
architecture is completely different.
But nothing from the philosophy school, really. No.
I don't
bust.
think so, no.
Yeah.
So, Michael, was the question that if you compare the particular form of the acanthus with something architectural, that we might get a clue?
You mean for data?
I guess so.
But this acanthus is generic.
Yeah.
It's not much to go with.
Also, the style of this head is very different from the style of all the sculptures connected with Herodes. If you look at all the other portraits that were collected by Goethe, you gave the reference there, it doesn't look like them at all. I think it's a completely different style, a different school.
Would you have a sort of even a very rough dating for it?
Antonine.
Antonine, yes, yes. Well, that's also my hunch, but then again, I'm not an iconographer.
And what's the marble?
White?
The marble is very tricky because I have to say that in the last few months, it has become clear that some of the portraits in Athens are made of Turkish marble.
Mhm.
They bring marble in from Göktürk and use it for portraits. This is a completely new realization, and it's not published yet, but and Göktürk marble sometimes look like metallic. So I think we cannot really say unless it's tested.
Wow, very interesting.
That is
They
interesting.
must have brought blocks from there.
Was it simply because of the demands of the intensity of the production here, or?
This has, I don't know. I know Brian Martins is working on this, and he's the one who got the idea that it could be Turkish marble, and he was right. I don't know why. I don't know why they do.
Oh, right. Small world.
Yes. Are there any other questions? I have to say, Antti, it was one of the most thought-provoking seminars that we've had.
Good.
It was great, and you know, it's always really good to throw ideas.
Well,
out there
exactly.
and see
That's what I thought.
As well.
That's what I thought. And I feel like, you know,
Thank
a
you very
good
much.
50-ish% of this was still sort of fairly solid. And I'm very glad that the other half was
great.
very
It was a-
convincingly
we did,
put down. Good
yeah.
stuff.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you.
So we'll have some drinks in the salon, and my children have been busy, probably hear them on this side, stomping up and down the stairs. But Michael, can you remind me, I have to talk to the youth to remember what the seminar is for next week.
Political violence in Greece, continued eating directions.
So that's Labrini and Italy. And you're all very welcome to come to that. It will be a kind of discussion type forum, and it'll be another quite a variety of discussion at that one too. So you're all very welcome to come to that. And otherwise, let's have a drink next door and quiz Antti even more.
Yes,
about this
please.
paper. Thank you very much.